This is a video demo for ListList, which is shown as list squared here, just to make the name shorter. We're going to start out by registering for an account. I'm going to just come up with an email and password here, and we'll take a look at how ListList works once we're registered. Once you register for an account, you're automatically logged in. You can see your account name up here with an option to log off. And ListList is letting us know that we haven't created any list yet, and it's giving us the option to create one. So we're going to click this Create New List button, and this modal drops down, and it gives us an input field for list title, which is going to be the name of the list. And we're going to type a name in here and create our first list. So you see this panel shows up with the list title, a button to edit the list title, a button to add new items to a list, a button to delete the list, and we still can create new lists using this button. And ListList let us know that we haven't added any items to this list yet, but before I do, I'm going to show how we can edit the title. So you'll see that the changes are saved here, and I'll add the first list item now. So it shows up in the panel body with two buttons, one to edit the text that you see for the list item and one to delete the list item, and I'll show how the edit works. And those changes showed up there, and now I'll add some more list items. Now we'll delete a list item. You get this confirmation modal here that just asks, are you sure you want to do this action? We'll create a second list, and once we create this list, it's going to generate a new panel with all the buttons needed to manage this list and the title of this list. And so now we can add some items to this second list. Now I'll add a third list, and then I'll delete a list. And I'll log off and show that if we log back in, that all that data is preserved between our user sessions because ListList is hooked up to a database. So you see everything is preserved between the sessions. And now I'll show some of the client-side validation. And in addition to the client-side validation, there's also server-side validation that we'll take a look at later in this video. So this is the SQL Server side of things. We're in the ListList Dev database here, and we're going to take a look at some of the tables. You'll see the ASP net user tables here, and those are used to maintain the user authentication system. And we have a list header and list item table, and each of those are used to maintain the list system. And so here in the list header table, we have a primary key that's an ID, and a title and a user ID that links it to the user that the list belongs to. And the list header is the containing list that has list items linked to it. So here in the list item table, we have a primary key that's ID, a foreign key called list header ID that links to the ID inside of list header, and we have a text field. And you can see here that foreign key from list item to list header. And both these tables were generated by Entity Framework because I did this as a code first approach. So we'll look at some of the rows on this table. You see we have our individual list, and they're each assigned to some user. And we'll look at some list items. And you'll see each list item is in here, and they're assigned to some list header, which is the list. And they have some text. And you'll notice there's no user ID here because the list header handles all the user link up. So there's no data redundancy. This is the code side of ListList. I used ASP.NET MVC with C# and Entity Framework using a code first approach to do this project. We're in Visual Studio to look at some of the code, And we're going to start with the models. We're going to look at one called list header. So list header is what I use to group multiple list items into one list. So each list item has a foreign key that points to some list header. So if I have 5 list items and each have a foreign key that points to the same list header, then I know that those items all belong in a list together. So each list header has a primary key of ID. They have a title, they have a user ID, which is a foreign key to a user that it belongs to, and they have a navigation property for the list items that belong to it. And then each list item, they each have an ID that serves as the primary key. There's a foreign key to the list header that it belongs to, and there's some text, and there's a navigation property for the list header. The account view model is used for like our login and registration forms. The create list header, create list item, and edit list header and edit list item view models are all used for our forms that we use to create and edit both list headers and list items. Dashboard view model just has a list of list headers so that we can show all the lists to the user. Error view model just has an error message. The identities models class was generated by Visual Studio, and it lets us connect to the user database, and it gives us other user functionality. Manage view models is also provided by Visual Studio, and it's used for like changing a user's password. ListList context lets me connect to the list database where all the list headers and list items are stored. And this override for on-model creating just make sure that Entity Framework doesn't add S's to the end of the table names. And this ListList initializer is just used to seed some test data whenever Entity Framework has to change the database up. For our controllers, the account controller is provided by Visual Studio and handles a lot of actions for like a user logging in and registering for an account. And Manage Controller is also from Visual Studio and handles actions like changing a password. List Controller is the controller that handles everything for the dashboard. We have an authorize attribute on it to make sure only logged in users can access this stuff. Here's our connections to the databases that we're going to need. So the user is always taken to the dashboard whenever they're logged in. At the dashboard, it gets their ID. It finds what lists belong to them, finds what list items belong to those lists, and then returns that to the user. We have 2 generic error view models here, one for the partial and one for a page. Here we have our create list header partial, and it just returns the information needed for the form to create a new list header or a new list. And on the post, we check that the form was valid. We try to create the new list and add it to the database, and when it's added, we return the user to the dashboard. Otherwise, there's an error. For edit list header partial, it takes an ID, make sure that ID is valid. We try to get the list from the database, make sure the list was in the database, make sure the user has the right to edit this list. And then we return the stuff needed for the form to edit it. And then when they post it, we check that the form is valid. We try to get the list they're trying to edit from the database. We make sure it exists. We make sure they have access to it. And then we attempt to save their changes. For delete list header, it gets an ID in, make sure that it was actually passed in. It tries to find the list that's trying to be deleted. If it exists, we check to make sure the user has the right to delete it. And if they do, all the list items that belong to the list are deleted first, and then the list is deleted and the user is returned to the dashboard. For create list item partial, an ID is passed in. We check that the ID is valid. We try to get that list from the database. We make sure the user can access that list, and we return the form that the information for the form. And on the post, we make sure it's valid. We try to create a new list item from the model. We look for that list in the database that they're trying to add to, make sure that list exists, make sure the user is allowed to add to the list, and then we add that new item for them. And on edit list item partial, we get an ID, make sure it's valid. Try to get the item from the database, make sure it exists. Get the user from the list from the database, make sure it exists. Make sure the user has access to that list, and then we return the information needed for the form. On the post, we make sure the form's valid. We get the list item from the database. We make sure it exists. We get the list that the item belongs to from the database. Make sure it exists. Make sure the user can edit it, and then save their changes. For delete list item, we get an ID in, make sure it's valid, find that list item in the database, make sure it exists, find the list it belongs to in the database, make sure it exists, make sure the user can access it, and then we remove the item. And that's it for the list controller. Now we'll look at the views. So login is just our login form. It's the panel we saw at the very start of the UI demo with a few input fields and the option to either log in or register. And register was where we signed up for that user account at the very beginning of the demo, and it's pretty similar to the login. So for create list header form, this is a partial, and there's a header and a body, and in the header there's just some basic info, and the body there's the form for creating a new list header. And create list item, edit list header, edit list item, they're all pretty similar. This is a partial view for errors, and this is a page for errors. This is the dashboard. There's some Ajax options here, what we're going to talk about more in a moment. The page starts by checking if the user has any list, and if they don't, an alert is displayed to let the user know that they need to create a list. If they have any list, for each of those lists, a new panel is created. In the panel heading, it's going to show the list title with a button to edit that title, a button to add items to the list, and a button to delete the list. In the panel body, if there are no items in the list, an alert is shown. And if there are any items, each of those items will be displayed with the text that belongs to the item, and a button to edit that text, and a button to delete that item. And then at the bottom of the page, we're going to have a button to create more list. There are two modals for the page, one for the delete confirmations and one for creating and editing both list items and list headers. The delete one has a paragraph tag in the modal body with an ID delete warning, and so it happens whenever you click a delete button for either a list item or a list header, a function is called in dashboard.js which populates the warning message in the delete modal, and it sets the delete button to point towards the correct action in the controller and pass the ID of the item to be deleted. The create and edit one works by having this div here called Ajax div. Earlier we saw the Ajax options, and those options are used by all the buttons on the page that are used to create and edit either list items or list headers. And so the options are set up to make a GET request, so it sends a request to the backend and it gets back a partial to display in that modal, and it replaces whatever is in the Ajax div with the new partial, and then it calls this show Ajax modal function, which just toggles the modal to show. And this is a page where you can just change your password, just has some input fields. And this is the manage account index page, which just has like the option to change your password. This is the layout of the page. This is what shows the user's name in the top right corner and the log off button. This is an error page. This is a lockout page. And the only thing left is web.config, and there's just some connection strings here for hooking up to the database for the list stuff and the database for the user stuff. And those are just two databases that are on my local machine. And that's it for the demo of ListList.